Hey guys, what's up? This is chapter 3, the British Atlantic World from 1660 to 1750. We're going to be looking at the middle colonies, in particular Pennsylvania, the southern colonies in general, the economy, as well as the New England economy as well. And then we'll finish it up with England and the colonial economy, now that we have been introduced to all of that. So right off the top, we're going to talk about the middle colonies, in particular Pennsylvania. If you recall, Pennsylvania is 4 colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And this map tells us a little bit about their economy and what they were exporting. Remember, these are British or English economies, so everything that they make, produce, and sell benefits England. Well, Pennsylvania, which is the middle colony right here, the biggest colony of the middle colonies, was established by William Penn in 1681. He was a Quaker, and he established Pennsylvania as a haven for Quakers, the way Maryland was established as a haven for Catholics. The reason the Quakers were being persecuted in England was because they refused to serve the military, since they believe, through their Bible-based conscience, that all Christians should stay neutral of military affairs. They also refused to support the Church of England. They did not consider themselves to be Protestants, so why would they be paying taxes to support a church that they don't belong to? As such, the king persecuted Quakers, and this is why many of them left England and eventually settled in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania, like Rhode Island in New England, was a more advanced colony because, check this out, women were able to serve as ministers. That's something that Anne Hutchinson would have loved. William Penn also believed that they should buy land from the natives instead of stealing it. He also established freedom of religions for all, including Native Americans, Jews, and some Muslims that they lived there. And then all men who owned property were able to vote. So the identity of Pennsylvania was ethnic diversity. For the most part, they were pacifists. They refused to go to war even with Native Americans, and freedom of conscience, meaning that you were able to practice and think whatever, express whatever you thought. So that was Pennsylvania, the only middle colony that we're going to be looking at. Let's look at the southern economy now, southern colonies. So remember, the southern colonies, we have Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia as well. Same thing, this map tells us a little bit of the products in their economy, a little bit more diverse, and we'll look at that a little bit. Because of where it's located, so it's the geography and the soil and the weather that they have in the southern colonies, their economy is based on agriculture. They grow a lot of rice, tobacco, sugar, and indigo. Now, this type of agriculture required large parcels of land and a great number of laborers. So the land was taken by Europeans from Native Americans. Some of them was bought, quote unquote, but most of the times it was stolen. So the plantations were owned by Europeans, predominantly the English, but the labor was done by first Native Americans, and then once they all died because of warfare and diseases, then African slaves were brought in. In Charleston, South Carolina, which you see right here, that becomes a major porter of slave imports as well. By 1750, sugar and tobacco accounted for half of England's exports, and again, those two crops require a lot of labor, and most of the labor was being done by African slaves. So African slavery had a big impact in terms of how the southern economies developed, and I would argue eventually how the United States would develop as well. Slavery became a lucrative business because Europeans, in particular British, bought the slaves for a certain price, and then they were sold for 3 times as much. So even slaves themselves were making money just by being people. Slaves also worked as shipbuilders, in particular in New England, warehouse, textiles. Women served as house servants, particularly if they had a skill in terms of cooking or rearing children. And they also, unfortunately, some of them served as concubines. So that's a little bit of the southern economy, but we're going to talk a whole lot more about it. So considering that slaves are being brought to the southern economy, this is how they got there. Make sure you take a brief note of the caption down here in the right hand corner, where it reads between 1650 and 1860, so about 200 years, approximately 10 to 15 million enslaved people were transported from Western Africa to the Americas. Most were shipped to the West Indies, Central America, and South America. And so this is the west coast of Africa right here. And most of the slaves were taken to Brazil. 5 million of them were. 4.5 million of them were taken to the West Indies. These are all a lot of islands around here, including Cuba and Jamaica. And then 500,000 were brought into the United States as well. Again, this kind of tells us what each of these symbols represent. Our key down here, so that is tobacco. Again, that's in Virginia and Maryland, cash crop. A little bit down south, we have cotton right here. We also have sugar in New Orleans that becomes huge profitable as well. And then rice in the Carolinas down there as well. Now, the way Africans got there was because they had to take a ship from West Africa down to the Americas. That voyage was called the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage, the definition is the Atlantic slave voyage from Africa to the Americas. These ships, as you can see in this sketch right here, those are all figures of slave people. And you see they're put down like sardines. These are overcrowded ships that cause diseases, seasickness. There was extreme punishment by the captains on board. Sexual exploitation and rape did happen, particularly obviously because of the women that were there. This was a horrible way to travel. 20% of all slaves died en route. Some of them committed suicide. They'd rather jump overboard and be drowned or take eaten by the sharks than serve a life of slavery. There were some revolts on board, but few were successful as well. And this photo just shows us a comparison between how some Europeans thought this Middle Passage was. Some of these slaves were free, they didn't have any bondage, they had room to move around, but this was the reality. And the caption again tells us a little bit more. So it tells us that some ships carry as much as 609 Africans at once, but the ship was only able to hold 482, and that shows us right here as well. So overcrowded, very horrible way to travel, and that was just the beginning of a life of misery for these African slaves as well. When they got here, they were given codes, laws, and these were some of the laws that the southern colonies established. It was illegal for Europeans to marry African slaves. So we see interracial marriages, and we start seeing the idea of ethnic superiority as well between whites and blacks. And unfortunately, that went on for a couple hundred years, and unfortunately we still have it somehow in some places. Other slave codes, slaves were prohibited from carrying weapons or to assemble in large numbers. They believed that if slaves assembled in large numbers, then they would start an insurrection. Slaves were prohibited from traveling unless they had a special pass. Otherwise, they were considered runaways and could be punished or killed. It was illegal for any whites to teach slaves to read and write. Masters could punish slaves severely, as you see in this picture here, the lash. And if a slave died during the punishment, the master was actually given immunity. In other words, he was free from any trial and prosecution. So these slave codes made it very difficult for slaves to live, a life in the United States. And these slaves didn't want to come to the Americas. They were brought over from their home country. And a lot of them ended up in these fields. So slaves worked in these fields. They help with different types of crops, like we already mentioned. In this particular case, you see that they are cutting sugar. Sugar becomes one of the most profitable crops, along with tobacco as well. Very intense labor, 100-degree weather, 100% humidity, and they were all out there, men, women, and children. And you see this slave plantation owner there. He was just there to supervise. Some of the slaves also had to work by transporting and shipping goods. Some of them had to work building the cargo that they used for transportation as well. So this was a life of misery. So in the beginning, when slaves were brought over, they were brought over from different regions in West Africa. So initially, these African slaves were unable to communicate with each other, and they were really unable to build any strong families. However, by 1750, about 75% of all slaves were American born. So now they were able to speak English for the most part, and they were encouraged by whites to get married, because by getting married, then they would reproduce, which then had more slaves. So they created strong families, strong kingships, and they also try to keep their African traditions of life, such as their lifestyle, some of their language, their religion, their foods, their music. And by doing so, they were able to maintain and sustain an African culture up until today in American societies. So with that as well, with them being able to communicate and create strong bonds, we start seeing some resistance as well. Some slaves start to resist what whites were doing. And the most successful operation that took place in colonial America was the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. So 69 slaves escaped to Spanish Florida because Florida was controlled by Spain, and Spain had abolished slavery in Florida. So these slaves that were running from South Carolina into Florida, they were free once they reached Florida. Now, rumors spread that there was going to be a slave revolt in South Carolina because some of these slaves were going to then run down to Florida to be free. So England didn't like what was going on because England was part of the owner of South Carolina. It was an English colony. So England declared war on Spain, among other reasons. And as such, some of these slaves rebelled. They started to kill several whites, including their masters. So the South Carolina militia is just the armed force, they stopped the rebellion, they killed 44 slaves, and they put everybody else under severe punishment and a strict watch as well. But some of these slaves did escape and gained their freedom in Florida, and this is why it's called the most successful rebellion that took place in colonial America in South Carolina. So that's what happens when you treat people really bad to the point that they can no longer take it. The New England economy, again, this map kind of tells us a little bit of what the New England's produce. So the brown represents furs and skin, the orange represents cattle and grain, and they have fish, iron, ship, rum, timber, and welding. So a third, or part of the lumber, a third of England's ships were constructed in the colonies because of the lumber that was getting from the New England colonies. And again, New England up here has a lot of forests, so they were able to cut down a whole lot of trees to be able to build these ships that you see here. And again, a third of the ships were then given to England for, in part, their navy as well. Lumber was also used for homes and furniture. They also fish, you see there. Cod is a type of fish. So the Puritans that lived here in Boston and part of the other New England colonies, they had a say, it said cod and God. So cod was good for the physical body and God was good for the spiritual body. And then we also have whaling down here as well. So oil was used for lamps, soap, whale fat was used for soap, and then the meat was consumed as well. So for the most part, the New England economy was based on a skilled economy. You needed to have some skills to be able to build a ship or build some form of furniture or build a home. Those people in New England that had no skills, they work in the docks and they were loading and unloading the different cargo that was being sent to England and that was also being brought into the United States. And we'll see how, particularly in Boston, some of these unskilled people actually are the ones that launched the American Revolution because of numerous laws that England eventually passes, which are England and the colonial economy. We'll talk a little bit more about this in class. But that was it for chapter 3.